Hello everyone, it's Rabbi Chaitovsky once again from my office at BMH-BJ. So nice to be... excuse me. I couldn't see for a second. Nice to be with all of you. We're back with Parshat Mishpatim this week. And I want to talk to you actually about seeing and about eyes, because in our Torah portion this week, we have one of the most famous and perhaps one of the most misunderstood and even vilified verses in the entire Torah. It says in chapter 21, Perek Chaf Aleph, verse 24, verse Chaf Daled, Ayin tachat ayin, that if there is some kind of injury done to someone, that ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, a tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, leg for a leg, and the Torah goes on, wound for a wound. And this notion of payback, that if you injure someone and you knock out their eye, the Torah seems to say that literally you have to give up an eye. And this verse has been misunderstood over time. It has been used almost as a rallying cry for the strict biblical justice and the vengeful attitude that the biblical justice has, at least Old Testament Hebrew Bible justice, as opposed to a more compassionate and perhaps more loving kind of justice that may occur elsewhere, perhaps in the New Testament or in Christianity in general. So Judaism suffers by comparison because of this particular verse. I know that last week I talked about the outline that was the Ten Commandments and the importance of having an outline to start with, because it leaves room for what we call the oral law, for Torah Shebaal Peh, which is the work of the rabbis in the 1st and 2nd centuries following the destruction of our temple to reconstitute Judaism and to explain what it was that the Torah was actually saying. Very few people live by the written Torah, but we do make every effort to live by how the rabbis have interpreted the written Torah. So in many ways you could argue that the oral Torah, Torah Shebaal Peh, is really what we do on a day in and day out basis within Judaism. Living by the Torah itself would leave a lot of gaps and would leave gaps in understanding and gaps in our behavior, because we just wouldn't really know what to do. And this verse is actually a great example of how the oral Torah was required to help us understand the verse, and it just grows from there. So just 2 comments about the verse. When it says eye for an eye, if you actually compare, if you want to take it literally, and you compare this particular run of suggestions, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, etc., and compare it to other codes that existed at the time that the Torah was written, for example, the Code of Hammurabi, you will see that in the Code of Hammurabi, the idea of eye for an eye was actually taken to its horrible nth degree. The literalness with which the law was applied stands in stark contrast to what the Torah is actually saying. For example, if someone builds a house and the house falls on the new owner's daughter, the builder's daughter is going to be put to death. That's eye for an eye taken far beyond even the most literal meaning of the phrase. Right? The Torah here says an eye for an eye. Not a life for an eye, not 2 eyes for an eye, not anything else for an eye. It's an eye for an eye. So in the context of its day, even taken literally, eye for an eye stands head and shoulders above the kind of justice that was meted out according to honored codes such as the Code of Hammurabi. By the time the rabbis got to this verse, they actually said that it was never really taken literally. It always meant money. that you have to pay money, and the whole system of paying for pain and suffering and loss and all of those, or medical bills, etc., all of those things grow out of these verses. The rabbi said, why was it money? Why could it never be an eye for an eye? Well, I guess what I did at the beginning of the video when I couldn't see straight is a great example of how eye for an eye might not always be just. For example, if the person whose eye I knocked out was 20/20, person had perfect vision, I am practically blind without my glasses. Legally, I am blind without my glasses. I cannot see at all without my glasses. To knock out my eye in exchange for the fact that I had damaged someone else's more perfect eye, that's not fair. My eye is simply not worth as much as that person's eye. So that would not be fair. And the rabbis in the Gemara and Bava Kama actually thought that by knocking out my eye, by removing my eye, I might die on the operating table. And that wouldn't be fair either. Then it becomes a life for an eye. So the rabbis always insisted that this verse was never to be taken literally, that it was always commuted to a monetary idea, because it was only fair. And that sense of fairness is actually what Jewish law and what Jewish tradition, oral Torah, is really all about. If the written Torah is supposed to mold our consciousness, so to speak, well, the oral Torah tells us how to put it into everyday practice. The final question that remains is, so why did the Torah write it in this language? Why did it use language of eye for an eye if it was so prone to be misunderstood? And the answer might be that as a matter of conscience, when you damage someone's eye and you render that eye useless, there really is no amount of money you could pay that's really going to ameliorate the situation, the new circumstances of that other person. All the money in the world is not going to ameliorate the fact that the person is now blind in one and maybe even more than one eye. Conceptually speaking, you need to understand, we need to understand that you've caused that kind of loss. And the only real recompense is to give up the exact same thing. But since we really can't do that, we can't measure that accurately, the Torah says, in practice, it's money. In theory, eye for an eye. In practice, monetary compensation will have to do. It's not perfect, but it's the closest that we're going to get. The oral law and written law work together. Conscience and practicality. Have a wonderful Shabbat.